Let me unmute myself. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shawana Snell, Supervisor of Administrative Support at the Yale University Library, co-chair-elect of the Yale African American Affinity Group, and a member of the Yale African American Affinity Group's Professional Development Committee. As the wife of an Army combat veteran and the granddaughter and niece of Army and Marine veterans, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Working Women Network's Yale African American Affinity Group and Yale Veterans Network National Military Appreciation Month hybrid event with John Mills. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping rules. For those of you tuning in virtually, we ask that you please keep yourselves muted and use the chat box, of which Miranda Monfilston will be monitoring to ask any questions. Please note that we will be sure to leave at least 15 minutes for an official Q&A. Now, without further ado, I will introduce our special guest. John Mills is a trained genealogist, independent scholar, descendant of enslaved and founder of the Alex Breen Corporation, a Connecticut-based nonprofit. Alex Breen Corporation focuses on research, interrogation, and presentation of lesser-known stories representing the life experience of the American enslaved, presented from an African American perspective. John focuses on unearthing little-known people and stories, then injecting them into the landscape of the communities where they lived and worked through art, monuments, and honorary street names. John's goal is to remember the forgotten and to apply critical thinking to our history to find solutions to the many ripple effects today. Please join me in welcoming John Mills for his presentation, followed by an audience Q&A that will be moderated by Devon Riley, Diversity Support Specialist for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and Work-Life and Child Care, and former Staff Sergeant of the United States Air Force. Thank you. Come on up, John.
Thank you so much for having me. Oh, I got 2 waters. This is awesome. Yeah, I appreciate you giving me the time to speak. This is a work of passion for me, and so anytime I get an opportunity to actually talk about it, it's an honor. So I'm going to jump right in. Generally, when I give these talks, I just start with my own genealogy and my own history, so you have a context as to why I actually do this kind of work. So I've lived here in Connecticut for 26 years now, but I'm originally from San Diego, child of the 70s. That's me in the picture on my far right, your left, in the middle with the crazy face, and with my mom and dad. My mother passed a few years ago, and my sister in the lower middle there. At the time in the 70s, this is shortly after a lot of African American leaders had been assassinated, and the temperature in California at the time was around pride in being African American, pride in your skin color, pride in your features, pride in your hair. The Panthers were just kind of starting to expand. Then they had a counter organization. The US organization was starting to expand. And my father aligned heavily to the teachings of these organizations. And so he was constantly talking to me about being prideful in my skin color and my hair and my nose, and not letting anybody else make you feel as though you're worth any less than anyone else. Something that he dealt with in his life. He was very fair-skinned in a family that most of the folks were not. And so he faced colorism often. So he was adamant of trying to get me not to have these issues, right? And so when I got older, I kind of did that with my kids, and that's them in the picture to your right. But I tried to do the same thing, but I learned in the early 90s when I got into the workforce that I actually was operating outside of that. I literally had to do a self-interrogation, and I realized that I felt as though I wasn't as valuable as white Americans. It was an unconscious bias against my own self. It took me a second, it took me into my adulthood, into the workforce, and how I was operating in the workforce, and how the people around me were operating, and how I was aligning to their thoughts and how they process before I realized I had these unconscious biases against myself. And so, I mean, that was upsetting, being a kid from a household that fought against that, to come to that place in my mind. And so I didn't want that to happen to my kids, to come to that place. And so I was trying to find a way to affect it so that that wouldn't happen to them. But I couldn't figure it out, how to do that, until my sister introduced me to genealogy in the late 90s. I knew my grandfather, my father's father, he had died in 1987. His name was Mylan Mills, but I knew nothing else about him. I was like he was dropped on the planet and our family started from that. Right? I didn't know, I had no history of it. And when he passed, I had no history of it. But my sister did some research and she goes, you know, we called him Papa, you know, Papa's grandfather was an enslaved man in Texas. I'm like, what? You know, you hear about slavery in this country and you probably assume if you're African American, you probably had some alignment, but I had never seen had documentation and kind of physical information relative to it. And so, my sister starts showing me these things she was putting together. She has this family tree that shows my grandfather to your far left, Mylan Mills, but showed his parents at the bottom and then his grandparents at the top, and highlighted in yellow was Ned Mills, the enslaved man who was freed on Juneteenth in Texas. And she found where he lived, where his family lived, and where my grandfather came from, leaving with the Great Migration to come to California. And so I was like, well, wait a minute, where is this place in Texas? We got to figure this out. Then she shows me the death certificate of his mother. And it said that she died in the Spanish influenza in 1918. And that I knew. I was like, the flu pandemic. So now I'm starting to get this alignment to, we're a part of history. Wait a minute, I know about that. And she had this picture. I'm like, where'd you get this picture from? She said she had contacted his family in Texas. And I was like, well, we have to go meet them. And she said, there's a family reunion coming up, we need to go. So we start planning a trip to go to this family reunion, all the time also looking at these documents she's finding. You see at the bottom of this document, it says that my great-grandmother, Eliza Mills in the picture, was buried at Hickory Grove Cemetery in Henderson, Texas. So we were like, when we're there, we're gonna go to that cemetery. We're gonna go figure out, like, where are these people at? We wanna see this. So we get to Texas and we go to Hickory Grove Cemetery, and it's a beautiful cemetery with beautiful stones. It looks amazing, but none of the people that my sister had placed on her tree were actually in this cemetery. And so I was a little dumbfounded until we realized there's this lightly driven path along the side of the cemetery that led into the woods. And then once we walked into the woods, then we started finding our family. Like, they were buried in the woods behind a whites-only cemetery. That lower picture is what it looked like when we got there on the 4th of July of 2003, ironically. And then the larger picture is us going back in 2022 looking for other family members. But it was kind of a spiritual experience, having to walk the same path that these members of my family, my grandfather's brothers and sisters, walked as well, having to look at this pristine whites-only cemetery, only to walk in the woods just like they did, right? It was something that I had to think about for a while. And also, I was processing my last name. You know, I had spent so much time aligning my last name of Mills to, like, you know, things that my family would say, you're a Mills, and Mills do this, and Mills do that. And now I had documentation of where that name began with my ancestry. It was an enslaver. And that took me some time to process. She also showed me my father's mother's lineage, which was incredibly telling. Everybody there highlighted in yellow is an enslaved person. That's my grandmother in the far left. She died in 1998. I knew her incredibly well. I knew her mother at the bottom there. She died in 1984. So I knew them incredibly well. But she starts telling me about my great-grandmother, Tony Kyle, in the bottom there, her mother, and she talks about how she was enslaved. She talks about how she was the child of an enslaver and their enslaved woman named Marguerite, who was a native of Africa, and this enslaver, what I call, raped her. And that was the progression of my grandmother, which was the lineage that then created that fairness in the skin of my father. Now, prior to my sister discovering this, my father would always tell me, I don't know, me and some of my brothers, we're a little fairer skinned because I think we have Native American in our family, right? That was the common statement. But now my sister had found it. No, it was here. It's this Irish guy named John White. On the left side of the diagram is my great-grandmother's father's line, and that led back to a man named Sam Kyle, who was enslaved by a man by the name of Claiborne Kyle in Texas. In Texas, they actually have a city named after this guy's family. It's Kyle, Texas. Actually, where Texas A&M plays, it's called Kyle Field or Kyle Stadium. So he was like, who that side of the family was enslaved by were like some very prominent people. This guy, Claiborne Kyle, was in the Mississippi Senate. He was a Texas senator. He was in the Texas House. Even the home that he lived in there is a national monument today, of which my family built. You can go there now and tour. It's a museum, of which in it they say nothing about my family. It's all really about his family. And he had 5 sons, all fought in the Civil War for the Confederacy. And so that was eye-opening to me. All this information, all this data relative to my lineage. And so we did the same thing. We were like, where were they buried? We found out there was a Kyle cemetery. So we go to Kyle Cemetery, and it was a similar thing. Like, I'm standing at Claiborne Kyle's stone at the Kyle Cemetery, but in the picture in the left, that's us walking into the woods. You can kind of see those woods from the larger picture behind my head. You can see those woods. And we walk off in the woods, and of course, back there, we start finding our family. It was like a common story. It was like these people were segregated in life and in death, right? There was a statement of value. And I started to listening to these things. It wasn't giving me a feeling of they were less than. I was getting a feeling of pride. I was starting to think these people were so strong that they were able to survive and persevere and endure long enough for me to exist. Like, that's where my mind started going, to my shoulders. Every time I learned a little more, my shoulders started going a little further back. Right? I was getting a little more prideful every time I learned another piece of information. My sister then started researching my mother's family. My grandfather, his name was John Smith. He was an incredibly, military-minded guy, a naval guy. Literally all of my life, anytime I saw him, he saluted me. He was like an incredibly military guy. But he passed in 2007, but when he passed away, he knew very little about his family. He was from Baltimore. He married while he was in the military, and then he was stationed in San Diego, which is how the family got there. But he knew who his mother and father were, and that was about it. After he died, my sister discovered that, she's telling me one day, Grandpa's great-grandfather was also a naval guy, just like him. Like, wait, what? She's like, oh yeah, his name was William Cooper, and he fought in the Civil War. And so I was like, well, how can you show me? And she shows me the lineage, and then she starts showing me his papers from the Civil War and the ships he was on. He was on the Commodore Perry, the Wyalusing, and the Albemarle, which was a ship that was a Confederate ship that was captured by the Union and then recommissioned as a Union ship. He was on that ship, and I'm like, this is crazy. Like, the more, I'm like, we're ingrained into the soil of this nation, right? My shoulders just getting further and further back. So, same thing, I'm like, well, where is this guy at? She's like, he's buried exactly where Grandpa's from, in Baltimore. They were all from Baltimore. And so we went there. Well, let's go find out where he's buried. And during the Civil War, they were creating national cemeteries because so many people were dying, right? And so there's a couple of national cemeteries in Baltimore. So I assumed he was buried at one of those. And she's like, no, he was buried at a colored cemetery called Laurel Cemetery. And so we went to Baltimore to see that. But when we got there, she knew this, I didn't. We learned that Laurel Cemetery had been paved over to make for a parking lot in 1957. And they told the family, well, we're going to move the body some 100 miles away. And the families complained, but nothing was done of it, so they paved it over. And then some 5 years ago, a few universities started doing research, and they discovered that all of the all the actual graves still exist under that parking lot. So they actually had never moved anyone. So there's like 30,000 individuals, count as they continue to count, buried under that parking lot, including my third great grandfather, William Cooper. The message again that I continue to get was, historically, the nation wasn't showing the people that I was descended from as valuable as white America. Even in death. And every line I walked down, I came to that same place. But conversely, I started to revere them much more grand and have much more pride in myself than I ever had. And I wanted that, that type of feeling to go to other people. I'd seen and felt as though many African Americans don't know their genealogy. Like, they'll know enough to go back to their grandmother or their great grandmother, but that's as far as it goes. And then they struggled for a multitude of reasons to go any further back than that. And then history didn't align well to allowing many African Americans to get back further than that. We've been taught value in everything but the African American story. And documentation on many of these individuals was very sparse. And so I had witnessed that many of the folks in my family and the people around me just didn't have a lot of interest. Not only did they not know, they just didn't have a lot of interest in their genealogy. And I was like, we got to do something about that, because this is some powerful stuff once you learn it, right? And so I was on a mission to figure that out. And since then, that's what I've been doing. Here in Connecticut, I started researching an individual by the name of Prince Mortimer in Wethersfield. He was one of the early people that I started researching here. I had been researching my own family and people in other states, but here in Connecticut I started researching Prince Mortimer. He was an enslaved man to a guy named Philip Mortimer, who owned a rope walk in Wethersfield, like a building where you made rope during the colonial times. He was a native of Guinea. He was brought here and enslaved by Philip Mortimer from the 1750s all the way through Philip Mortimer's death in the 1790s. And when his enslaver died, in the enslaver's will it said Prince Mortimer was to be freed. So he thought he was about to be freed. But unfortunately, the son-in-law of the enslaver challenged the will and won. And so now Prince Mortimer was enslaved to the son-in-law after having already been enslaved, for decades. And so some 17 years after that, he's accused of attempting to poison the son-in-law by putting arsenic in his morning chocolate. At the time, he was some 87 years old. The son-in-law says he saw the arsenic in the morning chocolate, so he didn't drink it, and he goes to the authorities, and now Prince Mortimer, at 87 years old, was sent to prison for life, and he went to Newgate Prison in East Granby. He stayed there from 1811 until 1827, when they shut that prison down. It's a museum today. You can go to that prison. But they shut it down, and they built a new prison in Wethersfield, which is where the DMV is in Wethersfield. And he stayed there from 1827 to 1834. When he died at 110 years old is what they said he was. But he never saw any freedom. It was just kind of a sad story. And I was researching him, and I was trying to find where he was buried, similar to my story. Where is he buried at? And many historians were telling me he was buried in the prison cemetery. But then I learned about this woman named Bathsheba Smith in the West Haven area, and she was a white woman in 1824 who had passed away, a young white woman, and she was buried. And the next morning, when her father woke up, she wasn't in her grave. And the townspeople went, well, it was some students from Yale Medical School that dug her up. So they go to the constable goes to Yale. Here at Yale, at the medical school, they were like, no, she's not here. But when they pulled up some floorboards, there was Bathsheba Smith under the floorboards. And so the governor at the time went, well, we can't have this. We're starting with new law. Digging up bodies is illegal. But if you need bodies for dissection, you can get them from the state prisons. And at the time, there was a state prison, which was Wethersfield. And so I learned that Prince Mortimer likely wasn't buried in that prison cemetery. He may have been sent to Yale Medical School because that was 10 years, this incident was 10 years prior to his death. So I was kind of stuck there, right? Well, where do I go now? A historian in Wethersfield goes, well, you know, there's another guy that I think was buried here. His name was Nicholas Monroe. He was in this prison. And so, in Wethersfield, so I was like, okay, let me go do some research into Nicholas Monroe. So I started digging into Nicholas Monroe, and it talks about how he was like this thief in Hartford. And he was sent to the state prison in Wethersfield, and having no friends, when he died in prison shortly after getting there, he was buried in the prison cemetery. So I was like, okay, well, I need some more information on this guy. And this historian in Wethersfield says, you know, he was in, you know, that Connecticut colored regiment. And I didn't know anything about a Connecticut colored regiment. But yeah, during the Civil War. So I started digging into that. Come to find out, yeah, there were these colored regiments in Connecticut. And he was one of the men in what was at the time the 30th Connecticut Colored Regiment, and he had enlisted. He had fought during the war and came back alive, and it was after the war that, you know, he was struggling to feed his family, and he starts stealing and he goes to prison. I start digging into him a little bit more, and there were some papers of the time after he died, because the Wethersfield prison was being investigated for treating the prisoners inappropriately, and in the papers there's this guard that says, this is right in the Waterbury Democrat, it's all within the Hartford Current as well, that this guard is on the witness stand and he's like, yeah, he was buried here, but, you know, we were asked to dig him up to send him to some institution. Right? Back to that Bathsheba Smith story. It's like some people were being sent to places for dissection, and it looks like he was one of them. And so my mind is going back to, and when I'm reading all this, it's going back to how I saw, you know, my family, where when I find them, they're in the woods or under some parking lot. And when I'm now seeing these two people that by happenstance, they end in like similar outcomes. Like I don't know where their remains are, or the remains weren't treated the same as a white American. And so I started to revere these individuals as well. I was like, well, who were these colored regiments? How much should we revere them? Who were these people? And so that took me into researching the Connecticut colored regiments. I was at the state library, and an individual by the name of Kevin Johnson told me, John, you know, if you want to research this guy, go see if he's on that monument in New Haven at Crisqualo Park. And I'm like, monument in New Haven? What? I don't know about a monument in New Haven. Like, yeah. And he's telling me how to get there. So I drive down to Crisqualo Park, and there's the monument. And I'm all amazed by the monument. And I learned that that's where the colored regiments of Connecticut organized in late 1863 into early 1864. I look on the monument, though, Nicholas Monroe's name is there. So now I was even more intrigued. Like, is this another scenario where there's these people that just, we're not revering them as much as they should be? And I wanted to learn more about the Civil War. Like, what did these men do? So then I started digging into, let me get up to speed on the Civil War. The first thing I learned, which is very appropriate relative to the story of the Civil War regiments here in Connecticut, is that after the Revolutionary War, the Militia Act of 1792 gave a template for how states were to create their own state militias. And there was a rule in there that's very clear. It's that you had to be an able-bodied white male citizen. So if you were African American, you weren't supposed to be in a state militia, right? And that becomes important because years later, right, as we're getting to the Civil War, something had to be done with that in order to even say that African Americans could be in any of these regiments, right? Something had to be done. So Civil War is underway. We have a major battle, the 7 Days Battle in Virginia, lots of casualties. And after that, Lincoln is trying to figure out a way to get the Confederates to like give up this cause, right? So he pushes the Confiscation Act, which basically was, all right, Confederate States, if we capture a location or we capture a farm or a building or a place and there's enslaved people there, they're now free and we now own whatever it is we confiscated. That was the first thing. But the second was to change the Militia Act of 1792. So a new Militia Act is passed, the Militia Act of 1862, and it now takes that word, a requirement of white out, right? And now it's like, African Americans now are authorized to serve in any person of African descent can serve in any of these state militias for any service that you see fit, right? And so that was the first thing in mid-1862 to kind of change the laws there. Another thing at the bottom of another section of that new Militia Act, which is interesting to me, is it tells you how much you're supposed to pay them also, right? It's like very clear. You pay them $10 and subtract $3 out of that for their clothing. So you're paying them $7. Where the standard pay for a white American at the time for any other regiment was $13, and there was no deduction for clothing. So they're literally telling them in the Militia Act of 1862, pay African Americans half, right? And so that became interesting to me, all of that, because that'll come to play later, that in 1862, after the Militia Act is passed, states start creating militias with African Americans. Some are southern Confederate states, areas of those Confederate states where Union was in control, right? So like Louisiana was a Confederate state, but the Union had control of certain areas. So in those areas, they started the 1st Native Guard, the 2nd Native Guard, the 3rd Native Guard. These are like regiments of all black people based on the changing to the Militia Act of 1862. Same thing in South Carolina, same thing in Kansas. Connecticut hadn't done that yet. Massachusetts hadn't done that yet. Many states didn't do it, but they could have, but they didn't. But then we have another major battle late in 1862, the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. Lots of casualties again. And so Lincoln, again, is trying to press the Confederate states to give up this cause. So he writes and states his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that if you don't by January 1st of 1863, then as far as we're concerned, all of the enslaved people in the Confederate States are now free. And so the Confederate States, of course, don't give up the cause. By January of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into place. And then shortly thereafter, in March, the Enrollment Act, basically a draft, right? It was each state had to supply some certain number of men based on the request. And that's when you start seeing some of the northern states starting to create regiments, like the 54th in Massachusetts. You start seeing certain states doing that. But Connecticut still was not creating a colored regiment. That was not something Connecticut was interested in. Until November. So in November of 1863, Lincoln, the federal government's coming down on Connecticut. They're like, we asked you for 7,700 men, and you've supplied us 2,300 men. You are 5,400 men short. So if you don't give us these 5,400 men by January 5th, we're doubling that. You're going to owe us 11,000 men. And you could opt out by paying $300. So I guess they could have figured a way around it instead of giving men by paying 11,000 times 300, right? But they put Connecticut in a bind. So Connecticut's like, well, what do we do? What do we do? And so someone says, why don't we just, like everybody else is doing, let's just do a colored regiment. And that was met here in Connecticut with disdain. You see it in the papers of the time, the editorials of the time. There was this gentleman, his name was William Eaton. At the time, he was a chief judge in Hartford, but he would go on to be a representative of Connecticut in the House and a senator from Connecticut. He was prior. And he's like, this bill about arming Negroes, he's like, that is the worst and most disgraceful thing ever. They're gonna go into homes with raping and murder, right? That was the context. It was like black people just didn't have the ability to do that type of stuff. They wouldn't be able, the decorum, they wouldn't be able to do that. And so there were all these challenges to this idea, but Connecticut really had no choice. And Lincoln was coming down on them. And so their approval was given very shortly after the suggestion. All this is within a 3-week span in November of 1863. So they decided, yeah, we got to do something because we got to do it by January 5th. That's what Lincoln said. So they raise a colored regiment. The thought was they would get 1,000 African American men to enlist. They ended up getting many more. Men were coming from outside of Connecticut that didn't get into some of these other regiments in other states. And they came here to Connecticut to enlist. Many men were in our Connecticut colored regiments that were not from here. And they met their quota for the 29th, was the first colored regiment. So they had so many men that they had to start a second. And so now they created the Connecticut 30th Colored Regiment as well. All of them organized they all went to Crisqualo Park ultimately, is where they organized here in New Haven. I found 2 books of individuals that were in that regiment. 2 individuals wrote their narratives. And it's very telling because I consider these books broader than just about Connecticut's colored regiment. These are books that will tell you about the experiences of any African American that was a part of any regiment during the Civil War. It talks to their experiences, and if you look at the papers of the time, it aligns to the experiences of any African American in any regiment. So I think these books are incredibly fascinating, and I recommend checking them out if you ever get an opportunity. But the 2 individuals were Alexander Newton and Isaac J. Hill. Alexander Newton was originally from New Bern, North Carolina. He fled there with his family, his parents, or his mother, and his brothers and sisters in the 1850s. He ended up joining the 14th New York Regiment. At the time when he got there, the Militia Act of 1862 didn't exist yet, and he joined up with a white regiment. There's no record of him ever being there because he wasn't supposed to be there, and I don't think they let him fight. They probably haven't had him digging ditches and things like that. But that 14th was sent out by the governor of New York to quell there was a riot going on in New York at the time, in 1863. They were sent to a black orphanage to quell this riot. Basically, white Americans were really upset with the draft that Lincoln had imposed, and they felt like African Americans weren't really citizens, so they weren't really being drafted, but them as white men were citizens, so they were being drafted, and now these black men that were former slaves were going to take their jobs. And also there was this huge riot in New York where they were just literally killing black people in the streets, and they started burning down this black orphanage. And Alexander Newton, as a part of the 14th, was sent there to quell it, but when he gets there, they start chasing him because he's black. So he ends up fleeing to New Haven, where his parents now lived. And while he was here, he ends up joining the 29th Connecticut Colored Regiment. They lived near where they were being organized. Also, when he gets here, he learns that his brother Stephen had died. His brother had joined the 54th. His brother had left. He was 18 years old, left to go to Massachusetts, joined the 54th Colored Regiment, dies 3 months later. So he gets here. He died in the same battle at the end of the movie Glory that you see in that movie. So he learns his brother died. He joins the 29th. On your right is Isaac J. Hill. He was from Pennsylvania. He came here as well just to join the 29th. He had joined the Pennsylvania 3rd Regiment prior to the Militia Act of 1862. They wouldn't really let him fight. Same scenario. And then he learns, they're letting black people have guns. And so then he ran to Connecticut and joined the 29th Connecticut Colored Regiment here in New Haven. They both talk about their experiences, but one thing that I see in the paper is there was already an inequity. Like in November of that same time period when Lincoln's putting this pressure on and the states is deciding whether they even want black people to be in regiments, the Connecticut Adjutant General's office puts out a general order because they needed people so bad. They were like, we're going to give you $300 from the federal government, another $300 from the state if you join by January 5th, because that's the deadline that Lincoln gave us. But like within a week of that, they realized, well, we don't want to give that to black people. So that's only for white Americans. So they put out another general order number 17, and they're like, well, wait a minute. If you're black, we're not giving you that state 300. But we'll give you this, we're not giving you the federal government 300, but we'll give you the state 300. Again, but you gotta enlist by January 5th. Isaac J. Hill, the man who wrote that book, he didn't know about that second general order. So he was expecting to get that $300 from the federal government that was supposed to come in $60 installments. He thought he was going to get there, then give him this $60. Also, there was a recruiter bounty or bonus. Like, who brought you gets $15. And all these black men thought, I brought myself. So you're going to give me $60 plus 15, right? I'm going to get 75, right? Well, when they get here, they're not giving that $75. And so they didn't know about that second general order that went out. I didn't know. So they were really upset with that. Interesting thing Isaac J. Hill writes in his book. He's like, they're about to be deployed. And he says, the flag was presented by Reverend Dr. Might. On account of the regiment not receiving the $75, which was promised them at their enlistment, they made no response to the presentation. I want you to process that. What he's saying is, they were so upset that they were being treated inappropriately and not paid appropriately that they did not acknowledge the American flag. Now, I've heard that before. I heard that in the '68 Olympics, like the black men on the podium putting their fist up. I heard about that in the early '90s when Mahmoud Abdul Rauf did that in the NBA. And he refused to stand towards the flag because of oppression in America, and then he got banned from the NBA. I heard about Colin Kaepernick. But I had never heard that our own Connecticut Colored Regiment right here in New Haven had done the same thing long before any of that. It's right in his book. He talks about it. And I've still never heard anybody ever mention it. They also talk about their experiences once they deployed. Like they left here and they went to Annapolis. And they didn't have guns yet. They didn't get their bounty yet. And they were supposed to get a monthly pay, right? That $7. They didn't know about the $7. They didn't know what was written in the Militia Act of 1862. So they were all expected to get $13, like all the white soldiers. But they get to Annapolis, and they start talking about their experiences. Maryland at the time was a border state, so they weren't a Confederate state. Like, they were just like neutral. And so the Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to them. Like, their enslaved were not free. They could still have enslaved because they hadn't left the Union. But because of that, when the 29th gets there, they talk about how the people there treated them really poorly. Like Isaac J. Hill talks about, a great many of the colored people had caught the distemper from the whites, their so-called masters. It was hard to find a pleasant family of colored people in the place. They appeared to be afraid to speak to us. Alexander Newton, in his book, he says, the colored people in this place were afraid to speak to us. Their masters looked on us with contempt. Like they felt racism while they're going out and about to fight. Same thing from Captain Griswold of Company B of the 29th. He's writing letters back. So this is a white gentleman who was leading a particular company, and he's writing letters back home to his sister, and he mentions it as well. He's like, yeah, we're in Annapolis. I've seen hardly anyone here but darkies, he calls them, right? He says, however, I suppose that there are some respectable white folks here. There seems to be a prejudice here against colored troops. So like I have these three narratives where they're actually telling you like they're fighting for the Union, but they're not actually being treated well while they're out and about. Incidentally, Alexander Newton, one of these gentlemen who wrote a book, he brought with him into the 29th, he brought with him his 15-year-old brother. It's wild to me. His 18-year-old brother just died with the Massachusetts 54th. And now he joins the 29th, and he brings his 15-year-old brother William with him. Well, they wouldn't let William fight, so they made him a servant to the same guy, Charles Griswold. So there's no record of him ever being there other than in the narrative books. Like, had Alexander Newton not written that, we wouldn't have known that there was actually 3 individuals from his family that lived here in New Haven that were a part of the Civil War. He also, Isaac J. Hill, he also talks about how during battles, while they were a part of the Richmond Petersburg's campaign in Virginia, how, and they would join up with other regiments and fight, other white regiments. He would talk about how there was a difference placed on the wounded based on color as well. He talks about how seeing an individual who had been shot in the head, and he runs over and props the guy up against a tree, and he sees the the medical people handling wounded. So he goes back to his station, and hours later he comes back figuring the guy's taken away, and he's still sitting in the exact same spot where he had been sitting. He propped him up. And that's this statement that he's making in his narrative. He says, "The complexion and rank of a man has a great bearing. There was a great distinction made among the wounded." So he's saying, like, if you were of lower rank or if you were of African American descent, you may or may not get treated quickly after being wounded. So all of this, again, back to my family, like I would hear the challenges that they faced, and the challenges they faced gave me more reverence for them. It was similar here. The analogy I use is if you hear about a person who ran a marathon, if you've never trained for a marathon, that would just be somebody saying they ran a marathon. But if you ever woke up at 4 in the morning for months training, if you ever had the blisters on your feet, if you ever went through the grind and the pain of preparing and then running a marathon, you'd have a different reverence for it, right? And that's what happened with me relative to my own family. And as I was reading their story, it was the same thing. It was like they weren't citizens. They wouldn't become citizens until the 15th Amendment in 1870. They didn't have to come here. They weren't being drafted. They couldn't be drafted. They weren't citizens. They volunteered. And then when they volunteered to do this, they're being paid less and they're being treated less while they're fighting for this country. To me, it just raised the reverence for who they were a great deal. Interestingly enough, they're now traveling back to Connecticut. War is over. Civil War is over. They're traveling back. And Connecticut at the time was deciding whether black men should be able to vote. So in the papers at the time, you see all these editorials about whether or not they should allow that. And so they put it up for vote. This is while the 29th is traveling back. And the state of Connecticut ultimately votes that down. They were like, nah, we shouldn't allow black men to vote. This is the vote was in October of 1865. Interestingly enough, the 29th knew that this was going on. So they're in New York, about to now travel home to Connecticut. And Isaac J. Hill writes in his book, the boys of the 29th were feeling somewhat indignant in reference to the treatment they received from their state, it not giving them their rights. It's like they weren't all happy about coming back to Connecticut. They did all this, in fighting for the country. But Connecticut, a month prior, votes down their ability to vote. Interestingly enough, as a requirement to rejoin the Union after the Civil War, the Confederate states had to register all black men of age to vote. So I have the documentation of my second great grandfather, Ned Mills in Texas, registered to vote 3 years prior to any African American being able to vote here in Connecticut. All of it tells you kind of a context of really kind of who Connecticut was, which I know is probably something different than you've heard before, but it tells the story very clearly. When they get here, the day prior to the ship bringing the 29th here, you can see in the papers at the time, Connecticut is trying to urge their citizens, please come out and support these men with the parade. Please show up, right? They're like 1,400 black soldiers who have gone forth to battle for many white men who have remained at home and abused them and their race. Like they're trying to guilt the state of Connecticut to show up. And they let them feel that the people of Hartford appreciate patriotism and patriotism in a black man as well as in a white man. Like they were concerned that the state wasn't going to celebrate them, but it actually ended up being a lot of folks that showed up for this thing. They sailed into Hartford. They stood at Connecticut's old State House. That building still stands, but there's no reference there to them ever being there. But they stood there in front of Connecticut's old State House listening to Governor Buckingham give them a speech. In his speech, he essentially is apologizing to them for the state not giving them their right to vote, congratulating them on what they did, but also kind of somber about the fact that they did all that and we just voted down their ability to vote. Again, the reverence I was getting for these people was getting larger and larger. So now I would have chased down, well, where were they, these two men who wrote these narratives, where were they buried? What happened to them? Because every time I go somewhere, it's something weird, right? So I start chasing down Isaac J. Hill. I learned that he went back to Pennsylvania and ultimately New Jersey. And he was buried at a cemetery called Red Bank Cemetery. And in 1962, Red Bank Cemetery was paved over for a parking lot. And they moved all the stones a mile down the road. And so I believe Isaac is under that parking lot that you see me standing next to on the right there, which wasn't something that I could kind of live with. So I went and found his actual stone that was moved to that other cemetery. It wasn't readable, so I worked with the U.S. Office of Veterans Affairs, and we got him another stone. And we've got a whole ceremony that's going to be occurring. My nonprofit is supporting on June 8th in Woodbury, New Jersey. The county is working with me on doing that. I also wanted to know, well, what about Alexander Newton, that other gentleman who wrote a narrative? And the really important thing about his story is to me, I gleaned from it, was his mother. His mother was an incredible woman. His mother was a free African American in New Bern, North Carolina, and his father, Thaddeus, was enslaved to a family that was related to Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And she wanted to free him, and she couldn't figure out how to do it. So she fled New Bern, North Carolina in 1859 to head to New York, and she started working with well-known abolitionists, Henry Ward Beecher, Henry Highland Garnett, and they helped her raise the money to go purchase his freedom. And then immediately moved here to New Haven in 1860 with their kids. And so if you kind of understand that story, you also realize like she's like this abolitionist. And then she has these 3 sons that joined the Civil War while they're living right here in New Haven. One of them dying during the Civil War. I see record of that. Up the upper left, that's them, the census document of them while they were in New Bern in 1850. In 1861, I see, as they did back then, the male figure of the household is the only one in the directory. In New Haven directory, you see Thaddeus Newton, his father is there in New Haven. I also read Mary Newton's pension application for her son who died in 1863. So in 1891, she's filing for his pension, and she talks about their life in 1863. She says, "My husband being unable to work, peddled apples," this is here in New Haven, "peddled apples and other fruit at the campground." She's talking about Crisquala Park. "And I peddled fruit and ice cream and did washing for the soldiers. We were accompanied by the boys, her kids, who carried the water and pushed the handcart." So she talks about how they raised their money. In her documentation, she also talks about how they were able to raise $100, and they used that as a down payment on a mortgage at 18 Winter Street in New Haven. They bought a home there, of which she would live in for the next 42 years until she died. She also talks about how her husband, the reason I learned in reading this pension document, the reason she was so adamant about freeing him is while in New Bern, he was diagnosed with consumption, which was tuberculosis. And the doctor told her that he was going to die. You can't give him no medicine. He's going to die. So when she frees him and comes here, she starts trying to feed him herb drinks, trying to find some solution to save him. But it doesn't work. He dies in 1868. And so he couldn't really work because he was so ill, and then he eventually dies. And her trying to figure out how to save him, she becomes this homeopathic doctor. And the records of the time show her here in New Haven going to these meetings of the New Haven Homeopathic Society, and they list her as Dr. Mary Newton, right here in New Haven, right? She's learning that because she tried so hard to save her husband. And so 40 years after that, she dies while at her grandson's house in what at the time was Derby. I think today the area would be Ansonia. But she still lived in New Haven. She was at their house taking care of her great-grandkids. And she knocks over a pot of boiling water, burns her leg, and the stress of that, she knew she was going to die. And so and she was 91 at the time, and because she knew she was going to die, she starts arranging all of the things about her death so that her family wouldn't have to worry about it. And it's reported all across the country. This is in the Boston Globe. It's aligned, the title of it is Arranged Her Own Funeral, Miss Mary M. Newton of New Haven. And it talks about this whole story about she knocked over the pot. But at the last paragraph here, it says, during her sickness, she had prepared all details for her funeral, putting a sum of money away which should only be used for that purpose, planned the style of casket she wanted, the part of the family plot where she wished to be buried, and even made her own shroud. After reading all this stuff I knew about Alexander because he wrote that book, but Mary Newton sounded to me like a heroic, incredible figure. I'm trying to figure out why people don't know about Mary Newton. So I'm back to my same context. Where's she buried? Right? Where's she and Thaddeus? I found out she's right near here. She's at Evergreen Cemetery. That's her stone. It fell over like some 60 years ago. Thaddeus and Mary Newton's stone fell over, cracked in half, and over the years it just started getting buried into the ground. So my nonprofit, I just can't have it, y'all. I just couldn't let that stand. And so we funded the repair of that. We stood that thing back up. We also worked with the Office of Veterans Affairs because her son, who had died with the 54th, all the black men in that battle were buried in a common grave, so his remains were never recovered, never given to her. So we worked with the U.S. Office of Veterans Affairs. We installed a memorial stone for her son Stephen right next to her repaired stone. We're unveiling that whole thing at Evergreen Cemetery on June 21st at 11 a.m. That QR code, if you guys want to attend, it's a free event. That'll take you to the registration link so that we can count the numbers of the people that are going to be there. A press release went out last week, so we're hoping there are going to be a lot of people that have the same reverence as I do for these people and will show up and honor like somebody like a Mary Newton, right? And with that, if you want to learn more about some of the many other works that my nonprofit is doing across Connecticut, New Jersey, and Maryland, you can go to alexbrienne.org. That's my nonprofit. Most of the stuff I do, we take donations, but again, to be honest with you, this is a work of passion. Most of the stuff I do is funded by lectures like this or out of my own pocket, generally. So if you would like to support us, that's where you would do it. And with that, I'll close. Thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Any questions?
I have a question. Excellent.
Thank you so much.
Excellent work. Excellent. Excellent. I'm sorry. I don't need the mic.
So
Oh, okay. I have questions later. There's
I
no
appreciate
questions.
you.
From your presentation, from you knowing the material, from how you display the material, and I'm gonna call it the material for lack of, I want you to hear from, my name is Crystal Coleman from the business office. I just want to say thank you to who sponsored you and having you here. This is excellent, and this is not, it's not void of your work. You've opened it up where I'm getting ready to teach one from speaking with my granddaughter, going into, and you just opened me up into another vein of what I need to know about, what I need to research. And I'm looking forward to my own personal journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. You know, I grew up learning about a lot of exceptionalists. You know, they taught me about a handful of people. I knew about the Martin Luther Kings and the Medgar Evers and the Rosa Parks and, you know, Harriet Tubmans. But when I started researching my family, they weren't related to any of them. And so no one gave me the information to have reverence for the common person, the common enslaved person that to me I now revered. And I wanted other people to feel that. These were incredibly strong people who persevered. They survived. That's why we're standing here, because they survived. And so that's what this work is about.
I just wanted to say thank you. It's true, your passion is infectious. Great storytelling. I don't know if I have a question, but I wanted to say that I learned a lot more about the colored regiments than I already knew, and I am doing a little bit of research. But what I do know is that often colored soldiers also had to pay for medicine, and white soldiers didn't. So it was more of a comment, and I was surprised to find that myself. But thank you for your work.
Thank you for your comment. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
And from online, we have a question. A question from Burrell. What was the name of the enslaved man from Guinea?
His name was Prince Mortimer. There's a book written by him. The original book written by him, well, it wasn't really about him. He was mentioned. Was written by a gentleman by the name of Richard Phelps. It was published in 1844. It was a book about Newgate Prison. And so he literally had like a paragraph where it wasn't about him. They just kind of mentioned, oh, there's this guy here. His name was Prince Mortimer. He was enslaved by this guy named Philip Mortimer. And he lived to be 110 years old. And then it was like, then, on to the next story. Like, it really wouldn't talk about him much. And then there was another book written about him in 2006 by a gentleman by the name of Dennis Caron from Simsbury. And he read the 1844 book. He thought, this guy was 110 years old, he's from Guinea? What? And so he started digging into his life a little more. And so I was kind of using those two things as the basis for my research into them, and I found like an abundance of stuff that were not in either of those books, which is also another basis for the work I do. What I was learning was the fascination of the prior writers were his age, whereas the fascination for me were the things that aligned to the things I experienced. Like the things about him, they would talk about how dark he was, like dark as night, like this colorism thing, which I had experience in. You couldn't find where he was buried. I had experience there. He talked about his trip from Guinea on that enslaved ship and the trauma of it. And I knew the trauma now of my grandfather's and why he had to leave the South. I'd learned there was a story behind that, why he had to flee the South. There was his incarceration and over something I didn't think he should have been incarcerated. He'd been enslaved for 70 years and they incarcerate him for trying to free himself so I was stuck on things like that. And it made me realize that the narrative of the story of these people is different when it comes from a descendant. It's different. So yeah, if you want to check into that story, I think you should, but that's a part of my work as well. It's like the context, the narrative based on life experience is a little different.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Pamela Cox, and I just want to commend you and echo Crystal's sentiment. I don't necessarily have a question, but she used the word fascinating. I would use the word deep. It's been said, people perish because they don't have knowledge of themselves, right? You have ignited a spark in me where I got to go back and look somebody up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then you just keep searching and searching. It's unfortunate that so many people have been forgotten and discarded.
Yeah.
But that's not true.
Right.
You know what I mean? Here you are some 50 years later or more, 100 centuries, and you still remember those underneath the parking lot, right?
That's right.
And that's not just their story. It's a lot of people in that parking lot,
That's
right?
That's right.
So, I mean, I don't want to just say, I don't even have enough words to be like, but I'm not going to leave here empty. I'm overwhelmed. I'm full. It was powerful. And just keep doing what you're doing.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I'm hopeful that, especially people of African descent, look into this, people. I consider this work that I do as activism, because I feel like these people weren't supposed to be found. I feel like it was set up that I wasn't supposed to find them. I feel like when I look for the documentation and the information, it's hidden on purpose. Like, it's hard to find. I got to dig into enslavers' lives to find crumbs of some of these people. Like, I wasn't supposed to find it. So I consider it activism, and hopefully it inspires other people to do the same. I also think about I got a granddaughter. Like, I think about 60, 70 years from now, the stuff that I've tried to instill, and if at that time the works that I was trying to put forth are just forgotten, like I was never here, of no value. And my descendants don't even know I ever existed on this planet. Like, there's some people here, Alexander Newton's, both of those families, those books that were written, I found their current day descendants. And they didn't know they were descendants of these people. They didn't know they were related to them, and they knew nothing of their stories. And so a part of my nonprofit, funded out of my own pocket, we put together a whole research summary on who these people are, the whole genealogy, all the documentation. We draw all the lines, and then we send it to them so that they can have their own history back. We did that for both of those families that we talked about here. And both of them are going to be at both of the events I talk about. The New Haven event at Thaddeus and Mary Newton's memorial at Evergreen Cemetery. That family that I found is coming down from Buffalo to be there. They just learned that they're related to them. The event in Woodbury, New Jersey, at the burial site of Isaac J. Hill, that family lived within blocks of that cemetery, and they never knew who he was. And so they're showing up with their family for that. And so, and they now have a pamphlet of information that now will begin a dissension of information to their own descendants, right? And so yeah, I encourage you to do that.
Thank you. Online question from Julia. Can we start a GoFundMe for the John Mills Tobias Cropper collab documentary?
Let's do this. I'm down. People have been very supportive of the stuff I've been doing as of recent, which I'm incredibly appreciative of, particularly because any exposure or support allows me to encourage and or perform the work to give some other family the same gift I was given. So yeah, whatever we got to do that, let's do that.
Thank you. And this one is a combined question from Jen and Jessica. Any plans to write a book about how you've uncovered these stories and the process of researching? And what has surprised you most about your research? Anything in particular, shocking / interesting?
I started a book, but it wasn't about my research. The book that I'm starting kind of ends at the beginnings of the research. It's meant to kind of show the path that got me to the place to recognize that it's important that I do that. And it ends at that. So that's something I'm still producing. I don't know that I feel all that comfortable about producing literature relative to the families that I'm researching, only because there are books about all these people that I've been given their family, their lineage of which none of them were asked whether it was appropriate that there's all these cells of books relative to their lineage, right? Nobody sought them out. It was only I that sought them out, and now they find that, for 100 plus years, people have been selling books about their family. And so that makes me not so comfortable with that idea, which is why, my book is really up until the beginning of that.
Thanks very much for that. That was really quite wonderful. I live close to Crisquolo Park and was aware of the monument and learned, I can't remember quite where that, is it Governor Buckingham? Is that the governor at the time that one of the reasons the colored troops were training down in Fairhaven was that there was reluctance and even fear to have the colored troops train with real weapons on the green for fear there may be a rebellion or some such. Is that in your research accurate?
I've never read anything like that. That would be interesting to me to read that. I've never read that, but I do know that they weren't given any weapons there. And they weren't given any weapons when they got to Annapolis. They weren't given weapons until they arrived in South Carolina, which the picture at the beginning of my deck is them in South Carolina when they first received their weapons. So there might be something to that, but I don't know that. By the way, also, the monument at Crisquolo Park is one of the efforts that I'm actually working on as well. That is a beautiful monument. It's incredibly beautiful, and it was created by some well-intentioned people. I absolutely believe that. But that monument, if it only was meant for the 29th Regiment, is missing some 250 names. If it was meant for the 29th and 30th, it's missing over 700 names. Not only that, there wasn't a lot of care with regards to some of the cities. There are some cities completely missing. Simsbury's not on there, and I got multiple people that were from Simsbury in the 29th. They're not on there. There's completely cities missing. There are some cities that are replicated. Canaan is replicated under New Canaan. And at the time, it was considered an incredible honor for a white officer to be a part of the 29th Regiment, because it was considered to be a harder job to control African Americans than being a white regiment. So the government really kind of like tested those officers, and thus also promoted them more readily. And so a lot of the white officers as a part of the 29th, they promoted. And on that monument in Crisqualo Park, every white officer is there, and they're a duplicate time for every time they promoted. So not only is the monument missing 700 names, there are spots that should be taken up by black soldiers that are taken up by the replication of a white officer being promoted. Like, it almost feels like a slap in the face. And so one of my works is to try to fix that. Now, when I talk to the folks that were responsible for that, they're like, it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to fix this thing. So I'm working with the Connecticut State Freedom Trail. We're trying to figure out how to raise the money to fix it. And so, it feels to me similar to walking into those woods behind the whites only cemetery. It feels similar to me to walking over that parking lot and descendants under the parking lot, to go down to Crisqualo Park and know that there are 700 African American people that are not on these walls. Like, their descendants, even if I found them, I couldn't direct them there. Right, it doesn't feel right. I don't know how to let that lay.
Just to follow up briefly, how do you explain that kind of stuff, plus the reaction to the troops returning to Connecticut, this kind of fear of the African American soldiers, much more so, it seems, in Connecticut, according to your talk, than other places here in a northern state? How do you explain that that state of affairs at the time?
I think that when Lincoln was elected, like, he was running on an anti-slavery platform, right? It was an idea of it's not moral, slavery is not moral. But it wasn't about abolitionism. It wasn't about making them equal. It was about, this is about us. We don't look right that we've got enslaved people. And he even told the black leaders of the time that he thinks that, we should end enslavement, and then we'll send all of you to South America or to Africa because you can't be in our, this is a white country, right? So, like, if you understand that context of Lincoln, then you understand that there's a much larger thing here, broader than slavery. There's racism, right? It's like deep racism, right? And I think it wasn't just Connecticut. I think it extended, right? But you have to be able to parse, anti-slavery and abolitionism. You have to be able to parse, we're abolishing it, but we don't really, it's not like we're trying to make them equal. And I think that was common. That wasn't just a Connecticut thing. I think that was a common thing. But Connecticut, I think, was clearly a little more, leaned a little more in that direction.
State to abolish slavery in New England.
Absolutely. And I can't remember, William Lloyd Garrison called Connecticut the Georgia of the North. There was a reason he said that, right? That's why. I think we have a perception of Connecticut one way, but when you read the papers at the time, it's very clear. And it's not hard to see that this state saw African Americans as less.
But why?
I can't speak to that.
So why does that stand out here? Is that something to do with Puritan origins or something?
I can't speak to that. I don't know what that is. I can just see it clearly in how the regiments were organized and the timeline of when they were organized and and disallowing voting rights even after the Civil War is over, and the context of our politicians with regards to the idea of having African Americans fight. I mean, it's just right there. I mean, it's not like you have to really dig for that stuff. It's like right there. You see it very clearly relative to Connecticut. So I can't tell you the reasons. I can just tell you what I find.
Thank you. That was the last question of the day, but before you go, we do want to give you a token of our appreciation.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.